Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're gonna be reviewing the album Z-Mice by the band Mother Turtle. Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog. So you know what's the most confusing thing about this album in particular? It is called Z-Mice with like a Z-E-A, but then it has one of the songs called C-Mice. And I was like, did I misspell it? Am I just being stupid? Did I write Z-Mice instead of C-Mice, which is the obvious, name for it? But no, apparently no. It just want to mess around with me and I don't like it. Anyway, here are some of my favorite bits from this album. Today we're taking a look at a very peculiar case of an album that rose above all the other albums in the band's discography, which the band itself is pretty obscure, with the rest of their albums also being quite obscure, but this one pretty much being well known. Now when I say well known, I don't mean by a bunch. But yes, today we're looking at Z-Mice by the band Mother Turtle, and seeing all the prog archives, it seems like this album is well known other than the rest, and I just really don't know why, but let's try and figure this one out. So firstly, let us talk about the band that created this album in the first place. So the band itself is Mother Turtle, but back in 2011 when these guys formed in Greece, they were actually called Hogweed, which I am not entirely sure, but I think it is a reference to one of their main sources of inspiration, which is of course Genesis, and maybe their well-known iconic track, The Return of the Giant Hogweed. Now right from the start, this band was established by a group of very well experienced musicians that have worked in plenty bands and projects in the past, and they've come together to form this band mainly for them to just be able to jam together, and they wanted to do so in a studio environment, of course, as well as on an on-stage environment, and just inviting anyone who wanted to listen to them basically. Now I just have to throw this one out there, these guys are from Greece and their names are just something else. I tell you, I'm gonna be trying to avoid just saying their names downright because I literally can't, and they're so intertwined and intermixed in ways that I just really don't want to get to. Sorry for the remainder of the video, I'm just gonna try and avoid that as I said, but in their first incarnation on their first album, we do get to see some pretty similar names, and I know that I cannot pronounce them on the top of my head, so I'm just gonna read them off screen right here. So we have Kostas Konstantidis, we have Kostis Hasupoulos, we have Georgos Theodorospoulos, and we have Georgos Maplatas. Yeah, I know. And as for later additions to the band, we actually have other players with equally confusing names, those ones being Babis Promodimis and Alex Kiornitizadis. Yeah, I told you, it's just something with those Greek names, Vangelis, but yeah. Now, sorry if anyone from Greece is watching this video and I've just completely butchered the names of your people. I'm really sorry. It just really seems funny to me because they're so out there, like unlike anything else that I know basically. But speaking of those two added members that were actually added from the band's sophomore album, these guys have incorporated some new instruments into the pretty basic rock mix that they had prior to that with the drums, bass, keyboards, and guitar. These two guys actually brought forth both a violin and a saxophone as well as a flute in one of them, but it doesn't actually make an appearance on today's album of Topic. Now, I think I jumped myself a bit over here because we have to go back a bit. So since forming in 2011, these guys have started playing in live settings in 2012, and throughout the course of a year or so, they have started to formulate their own songs, which they then went into the studio in 2013 and worked them out and recorded them and released them as their debut self-titled album, of course also changing their name from Hogweed to Mother Turtle. And unlike some other Greek bands which we've seen or heard of, these guys were actually pretty much loyal to just staying inside of Greece, not going abroad, not just originating but then recording somewhere else. These guys stayed in their hometown or home place of Thessaloniki, where they've recorded and produced and created all of their albums from their first up until their latest release this year. Now, this is a band that right from the start basically released their music over on Bandcamp, which means online releases, and well, they've been pretty successful doing so, and they've done so for their debut album as well as their sophomore album, and then in 2018 they came out with their third studio album called Z Mice. And well, this one, for no apparent reason that I really don't know, was able to get much more traction from a lot of people and even bring in some unacquainted and unfamiliar people with their music, much like, well, me. Now, the odd thing about this one is that over on the Prog Archive, Z Mice actually has a rating of 3.92, so it's not like it's a masterpiece getting like a 4.5 rating. No, it's actually pretty decent compared to a lot of other albums that I've seen floating around. And the fact of the matter is, out of the 5 album discography of these guys, this is not even their highest rating. This is actually their mid rating, with 2 of their other albums having more higher ratings basically. But the thing with this one, just the traction around it is pretty large. We have their debut with 61 ratings, then their sophomore albums with 76, and this one has 121 as of making this video. And you know, talking about their albums after this one, they're really underrated. You know, people just don't seem to know about them, with like 16 ratings and 9 ratings, which is really nothing. But you guys don't care about this. I don't know why I'm talking about this. We want to talk about the music. We want to talk about the prog itself. And well, how progressive is this album? And well, we gotta understand where this album falls in our categorization. So firstly, as I said, this band started off as a jamming band. They wanted to jam together, and with that comes yet a lot of improvisation. And this definitely shows on this album, despite the fact that I wouldn't really call this album a fully improvised album, but instead an album that originates from improvised ideas and then reworked inside of the studio environment. Now, the music itself is what I would mostly consider to be some heavy prog, sometimes even verging a bit on metal, maybe some interludes that sound like Dream Theater, when at other times it actually goes more in the direction of jazz. And that really shows, of course, with the saxophone solos as well as some really sporadic piano and keyboard solos done by Theodoropoulos. Yes, I got that name, I got the name. And this album as a whole divides itself into 3 parts. It literally does divide itself to 3 parts, calling the songs firstly by their part and then by their name. And well, you would expect that the parts would at least flow into one another in a way, but they definitely don't. They don't seem that related all that much, and I honestly don't really get the parting of this album. Now, while parts 1 and 2 are pretty nice, with #Cornhub being my favorite from part 1 and with Titan Lick being my favorite track from part 2, I do believe that they just don't stand in comparison to part 3, which is definitely the monolith from this album. This part 3 is made out of 2 separate tracks. The first one is called Vermin's Reprise, which is supposed to be a reprise of a track called Vermin's from part 2, but I honestly don't see any connection between the two, and this piece is just a really short and sweet piano and guitar piece, which I personally really liked. But the real kicker in part 3, and the real kicker on this entire album, has to be Nostos. Nostos whatever that might mean. It's a 16-minute long, almost fully improvised piece, which is just brilliant. It's excellent. It's so freaking good. Yes, I know that sometimes I just don't like these fully improvised pieces that don't really have any cohesiveness to them, but honestly, this one, very well made. You can definitely tell that the original ideas to create this one came up on stage but were then thought over and reworked inside of the studio to create what this one is. Almost all the instruments on this piece get the light shined on them at a certain point. We have the various keyboard solos as well, the guitar solos and the violins and the saxophone, and even the drums get like some really interesting beats inside of there, and you might be thinking to yourself, well, where's the bass? And just rest assured, the bass itself is basically the glue that brings everything together on here, and I honestly loved it to bits. Now, not to say that this entire album is just really monotonous and repetitive, but it kind of just doesn't really act out any memorable parts, and you might have saw that with the fact that I really didn't have a lot of favorite bits from this album. But when it comes down to it, this last track, Nostos, is just a memorable bit on its own. It is really progressive. It goes in many different directions. It changes paces, it changes time signatures, it changes everything, and it just causes some eargasm, which I personally really like. I think that in comparison, I would call Nostos one of those very Canterbury-esque tracks. If you took out the absurdity, if you took out the really unexpected parts and you put in more heavy prog inside of it, it just kind of feels like that. It feels like the band are going on a tangent, but it's really good and also very well realized with not being too over the top or too unexpected most times. And while I think that this track is a great track, I think there is one flaw to it, and the flaw itself is not really to this track in particular, but to the album itself, and that's the way that it is being structured. You see, this track, in my personal opinion, should just be everyone's favorite from this album, right? I really don't see how anything else can top it. But it comes out at the end of the album, right at the end. You know, this is a 50-minute long album. This comes all the way at the end. And honestly, when it comes down to these Bandcamp bands, you listen to their music online, and if you don't like what you heard at the start, you're probably not gonna stick around until the end, and you're not gonna discover how good this album really gets at the final track. And well, if I had my own way with this one, I would put Nostos as the beginning of the album and then put all the rest afterwards, and maybe it would even look better in a different light after starting off this album so strongly. But unfortunately, all in all, yes, most of this album was pretty underwhelming, deserving of ratings around like 6 or a 7, but then we get this final track, which actually takes about a quarter of this album's runtime, so it's something to be reckoned with, which I think really saves this album for me. But as a whole, if I'm gonna come back to Mother Turtle, I'm gonna come back to this track in particular and not this album as a whole, but still I'm pretty interested to see what their other albums in their discography have to offer. Now, while looking at this album cover and thinking to myself that it is nice, I must also agree that it really isn't something that special. I feel like the idea of going out and just photographing something that exists in real life and then putting it as your album cover is a nice idea, and yes, after all, my favorite album just has a cow in a field on it, so it's not like I can speak. But the thing is, it feels to me like all of these Bandcamp bands are just kind of getting lazier and lazier with their album covers because they don't play this big part. You know, you don't see them on a shelf in a music store. You just kind of go to the band, you take this album online, you listen to it. The cover doesn't really play such a big part in it, and well, I think it's a bit of a shame because then we start seeing covers like this one. Now yes, subjectively I actually do like this cover. I like the framing, I like what they try to photograph here, I like the main focal point, I like the colors. It is a nice one, and I think I would photograph something like this myself as well. But overall as an album cover, I think it's a bit meh. So all in all, when it comes to the rating of this album, I do feel like this one sits quite comfortably at a rating of 7 out of 10. But that's about it, guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for tomorrow because we're gonna be listening to Frequency by the band IQ. I totally forgot that we had another IQ album on the list. I was definitely sure that we finished with these guys a few days ago, but apparently we're not. So yeah, that's the case. Anyway, I'd like to thank my lovely supporters over on Patreon, so thank you so much to Clay Wan, Wrist of Kings, and Lindsay Acox. You guys are just the best. And if any of you want to support me over on Patreon, you can find the link down in the description or in my About page. But that's about it, guys. Have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye, guys.